Hey, good morning, Sophia Church. Welcome from Boston, Massachusetts. That's where I'm currently residing in for the past few days, and it's my birthday week. Michaela said, flee, leave, find something fun to do, and I said, all I want to do is go to Massachusetts and see my Red Sox play the Yankees, which is a very difficult ticket to get, and I'm going to go ahead and place the hat on because I'm a Red Sox fan. And we took it to them last night, and that was very good. So we beat the Yankees, and part of my gift to myself is playing golf tomorrow at a really nice place up here in Massachusetts with a bunch of friends from church from way back. And Miro will be glad to hear that I'm actually picking up the clubs again. And by the way, happy birthday, Miro. I'm sorry I didn't get to call you, and I just want to verbalize that right now. So happy birthday. And anyway, so we're going to jump right into things here. We're going to watch a YouTube video clip that was done to test out a number of different theories. And I just want you to watch this clip. And if you've seen the moving shell game, this is kind of like that. It's very difficult, but you're going to have to count the number of times a basketball is passed between different players. And in this case, there are two teams of three people, and one team is wearing black shirts and one team is wearing white shirts. And you're going to have to pay attention because the white shirt team is the one you need to count the passes for. And passes are passes where it's passed from someone and received by someone. I needed to make sure Jimmy knew that. That's what a pass is. It's not dribbling Jimmy. So anyway, go ahead and watch the video, get the number of count, and then I'm going to pause it for a little bit. I want you guys to just discuss amongst yourself what the number is, what you think the number is, and any other thoughts you have regarding the video. But then then we'll come back and watch the rest of the video. Anyhow, we'll talk later.
Count how many times the players wearing white passed the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
So we just finished the video, and I wonder how many of you all got 16, but how many of you all actually saw the gorilla in place and also the black team shirt leaving person, and then also lastly the curtain changing. I never saw the curtain changing, so that was interesting. But it's interesting. I think that video is important because we can get fixated on something and it can really change the direction or keep us in a direction of not seeing other things that might be availed to us otherwise. And I think of it's a concept called the Lullaby Effect. And if you're familiar with lullabies, I don't know in Bulgaria if you probably have traditional lullabies that you would sing to your kids and talk to your kids that would put them to sleep, or they would use in the playground or whatever. And so in America, we have these lullabies. But the lullaby, basically, you get into this routine of saying the same thing, and you can miss things. You can not realize what's happening. And some of the lullabies that are very popular in the U.S. actually are very dark. We have one called "Ring Around the Rosie." Mark, you probably remember this one. But ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. And all the kids would get around, it's really cute, and they'd fall down. But in reality, that whole thing was based on the Black Plague and the bubonic plague, basically. And so, ring around the rosy was the rings that would go around these pus-filled nodules that would form in your skin. And when these things would pop, they would just reek and smell. It's the smell of death. And so the posies were to mask that smell, these flowers. And then the ashes, ashes, we all fall down, is death. And so the kids are, in their lullaby, they're singing all this stuff, but it's really kind of a dark type of lullaby. But we can get lulled into sleep with the stories that we tell each other. And just like that video, we can do that even with the Bible, with Bible stories. And I've had that before. You probably have had that before, where something kind of lights up because you're seeing it from a different perspective, a different paradigm. And this has happened to me recently as I've studied out getting into the Old Testament and looking at things, studying under one of my favorite authors right now is a rabbi named David Foreman, and he brings out things called the midrash, which are commentaries that were done by people of that time looking at the Hebrew text. And some of them are way far out there, but there's some that dig into the intricacies of the text, which are very, very interesting. And even my own Bible studies, I'm reading through these things. I'm like, oh, I've never seen that before. Maybe there's a different story being told, or it's adding to the story I already know. Not to discount those things. And so there are two stories that really come to play, but they're all captured first in Hebrews 11. And over in Hebrews 11, we read about the heroes of the faith, and the two are mentioned here. And in verse 32, it talks about Samson and David. So if you read on your own, verse 32 through the following, through the chapter, you see that the judge, Samson, around 1000 AD, and David and Goliath, which is about 40 or 50 years later, are mentioned together in this loop of heroes of the faith. And I'm in agreement with that. You're in agreement with that. And you have to ask yourself, what are the stories, what are the lullabies we've heard, or the narratives that we've heard regarding Samson, regarding David? And, for me, Samson was big guy, strong guy, takes the gate, kills all the Philistines. Samson and Delilah, that whole story of cutting his hair. So these are etched in my memory regarding Samson. But you look at, and then with David, I look at David and I think of the story of David and Goliath, and the narrative there was always small guy beats big guy. It's used in movies throughout, regarding the underdog takes over and wins. And it's a great narrative, and it's so inspiring. And not to say that it's not in play, but is there something else also embedded within the text that God is trying to get our attention to? And the thing that really...
And David put his hand in the bag and took out a stone and slung it. And it struck the Philistine on the head, and he fell to the ground. Amen.
Attention to. And the thing that really got my attention was, especially with the character of Samson. Samson, out of the judges, he was the seventh judge, and out of all the judges, he probably was the most derelict, the most, fell in human deficiencies the most. I'm trying to frame it in the best way possible. You look at him, you go, who is this guy? Why did God choose him? He was chosen to be special. He was chosen to be a Nazirite, and that was what his upbringing was. And yet there was so many failings that he walked through. and yet here he is in Hebrews 11. Way to go. Well, how's that work? And so we're just gonna do a quick dive into both characters, and I don't want to keep you too long. But looking at Samson, Samson really was the seventh judge, like I mentioned, and you begin to get a feel for the narrative when you see what's missing from the text. So not just reading the text, not just reading the Bible and saying, oh, here's something that's very interesting, but I start looking for things that are not included. And so if you read about the different judges, there's a pattern of the first six prior to Samson. In the six, they always said the people cried out and God responded. He gave them a judge. And that's not the way it was with Samson. Samson, it says, there was no mention of that. He's the first one to come into play where a judge was installed without a cry from the people. And the rabbis of that time, the scholars of that time, back in the prior to the first century, felt that there was probably some indifference. The Philistines were a people that initially God had said, as Joshua and the crew moved into Israel, move these people on out to give you the land. And yet they didn't do it completely. And so they were always plagued by these people that thrust their way of life, their idol worship, all the different things that complicated and corrupted the Israelites were now in place. They were embedded within these communities. And so God was like, we need to deal with this. And so the judges came in when the people cried out after these things. But the interesting thing is with Samson is that there was no cry out. And so you begin to think, well, God was looking and saying they need to have a passion to get this right. And the people were actually okay with this way of life, this idolatrous worship, all the different things that were going on around them, for them to be embedded within this community. And obviously that strikes home because we absolutely can get used to that type of world around us, and we become more like the world than what God really desires. So anyway, Samson was brought into that world. He was also tailored to be a Nazirite. And you can look this up later, but in Numbers 6, right at the beginning of the chapter, it mentions what a Nazirite is. To take a vow was done by the individual. That person was not to drink anything of wine, of grape juice, of raisins, anything from the vine. A Nazirite vow was only for a period of time. It wasn't for your whole life. They weren't to take a razor to their head. They weren't to cut their hair. And also, they weren't to be involved around a dead body. And that's really interesting too. So these things pop up about God. Why, God, would you want Samson and give him to have him live in this vow as a Nazirite? And one of the aspects of that is not to be around a dead body, when clearly, when you look at the judges, there's going to be an interaction with the Philistines, and usually it includes death. And usually it includes that individual pursuing that and being around death. And so right at the beginning, there's this weird tension, and so really enjoy looking at this. And I love more questions than answers. I love when there's more in there that I'm struggling with, I'm trying to figure out. So anyway, Samson, this is what he was brought up into. And right away, Samson is totally beginning to track in the wrong direction. And but prior to that, in verse 25 of chapter 13 of Judges, it says, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he was in this area. And the Hebrew word is this word that's spelled P-A with an accent, A-M. And let me just quickly mention, the Hebrew language is a very narrow language, as far as it's not as robust, it's not as big as the English language or any other language. English language, you can find words, hundreds of thousands of words to describe something. The Hebrew language only has about 8,000. And so there are multiple ways of looking at something, and so you'll see this throughout the Bible. And the word to stir is really to disturb, to push, to move. Those are the aspects of that. And the midrash would look at that and they'd say, there's something, maybe, he was told by his family, obviously, that he was to move into this judgeship and engage the Philistines. And at some point, maybe he was a little resistant. And it says that God had to come down and disturb him and to push him and to move him into the narrative and into the story that he really wanted him to walk through. And he doesn't walk through it well. He right away so he gets stirred, and he goes, if you go into chapter 14, he wants to find a Philistine wife, and you have this story of this lion confronting him in a vineyard as he's approaching the town where he's going to get this woman. And without getting into massive detail, the lion throughout the Old Testament was really a representation. That's what they saw. A lion was a representation of God really interfering with the direction of a king, of a people, or something. And so it was very symbolic, but it was very real. And so when you read the actual point when the lion approaches, it says, after the lion approached and came towards him in verse 5 of chapter 14, it says, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. And what's interesting about that is that, the word that talks about came powerfully actually is, I have the word up on the screen here, but it's to be rushed. It rushed him. It brought him really it rushed upon him. So it came powerfully on him. And so if the Lord was sending this lion to run interference, knowing that he's moving towards this Philistine woman, this word "so that" really creates this imagery that the Spirit came on him so that he could tear this lion apart. But when you look at the Hebrew, the word "so that" is not in there. That's an interpretation that was done by the authors to say, okay, well, all these words are jumbled together. I think this is how this plays out. But if you take that out, it's not there in the Hebrew. You take that out, it takes away the purpose of why the Lord moved him or came powerfully on him or rushed him, was maybe to cause an interference and say, think about what you're doing, Samson. Don't pursue this. Don't move through this. And yet Samson, symbolically or whatever, kills the lion. But he's also around a dead body again. And then there's honey in the carcass of the lion, which he gives to his family, which causes them to be unclean. What I'm trying to do is paint this picture that Samson really, oh my gosh, he had a messiness and deficiencies that were part of him that were amazing. And yet, again, he shows up in Hebrews 11. And so it goes on, and you see him constantly escalating in his violence and his retribution towards the Philistines. And it isn't an eye for an eye. It's something even more significant. You can read the different stories about them. And then we have the story of Samson and Delilah, and then the death of Samson. And yet you have to ask yourself, well, so why is he famous? Why is he in Hebrews 11? And I think it really resides in that beginning page. What was not stated was that the people were not engaged. They weren't crying out. And he was called without the people crying out. They were getting complacent. They were getting used to things. And even Samson had a bit of that in him. And he had to be pushed forward and moved and get stirred. And yet he does the best he can. So Samson moves forward in this narrative, and he still achieves something that in the end God says, I'm pleased with this. And so I want you to hold that thought for a second, and we're going to shift over to David and Goliath and look at David and Goliath's situation. So again, the narrative that I've grown up with is that Goliath is the big guy. He should win, and David's the small guy. He should absolutely lose. So you get into this, and you see in verse, David comes on the scene. Battle lines are drawn every day. Goliath comes out, taunts everybody, and Israelites, fearful, run back to their lines. They're not going to engage. So they don't engage. They don't engage. They don't engage. And this goes on a long time. David shows up, shepherd boy, and he's irritated by this. He says, what's going on here? And so we pick this up, and he goes and he tries to convince Saul, the king, that, hey, let me do a one-on-one with this guy. I can do this. I can take him. He obviously had confidence. And in verse 32, David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and he will fight him. Saul replied, you're not able to go out against that Philistine and fight him. Look at this. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. Okay, so the narrative that I would expect is this. I would have that sentence changed if the narrative is small versus big. I would expect that sentence to say, you are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only small, and he is large, and he has got weaponry. But that's not what was stated. So there's something, that was very interesting to look at this and to go, that's not the narrative. And if you look throughout the Bible, you look through the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are no stories about this Goliath-David interaction. Just inferences. I think Hebrews 11 talks about a few things, but there's nothing describing small versus big, and you'd think there would be in the Jewish faith, because they always have been small. You think they would have leaned into that story, but it's not there. And so it gets you to think, what's being communicated here? And so what we don't understand, what we don't learn or don't understand is the weaponry of that time. And so if you go in and it talks about David in verse 34, when he's describing to Saul, hey, I do have experience. He said, when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, I struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it and so he goes into this whole thing and he says, this uncircumcised Philistine will be just like him. And Saul's looking at it going, okay. But what's really, really interesting is that we don't have an understanding of warfare in that time period. And so to me, a slingshot, as a kid, I'd buy a little slingshot, you try to hit a bird, I wouldn't do that now. But, it's one of these things, just kind of pull back and look. Back then, it was a leather thing that encompassed your arm, and it was a deadly, deadly weapon. It was extremely, extremely accurate for those who used it. Matter of fact, look over in Judges 20. We're going to tie this together, but over in Judges 20, over in around verse 15-ish, 14, actually, middle of 13. But the Benjamites would not listen to their fellow Israelites. From their towns, they came together at Gibeah to fight against the Israelites. At once, the Benjamites mobilized 26,000 swordsmen from their towns, in addition to 700 able young men from those living in Gibeah. Among all these soldiers, here it is, there were 700 select troops who were left-handed, each of whom could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. So there was, even in the time of the judges, this is the time of David, there was an efficiency and a talent with this deadly, deadly weapon. They could split a hair, which may be hyperbole, but they were extremely accurate with this weaponry. And David knew that. David knew he'd been engaged in this weaponry. So this weaponry was used, and they would use it on the front line. And so coming on in, I think that there's something else that's here. There's another narrative. There's a narrative of engagement, a lack of engagement. Saul was not going that route. Saul would not engage his people. Saul was not moving towards Goliath. And Saul should have. If you notice, it was the Benjamites who were the ones who were well trained in this weaponry. And yet, you look at where Saul was from, he was also a Benjamite. So he was part of that clan. Whether he was talented in that area or he had guys he knew who could do this, there should have been a movement towards Goliath with confidence that this would happen. So Goliath comes out. He's all encumbered by all this gear. David goes and he picks up these smooth stones and he goes, I will take those odds. And I think the story is the better odds were on David to have the power of God with him, but also he was confident in how God had worked with him and the talents that he brought to the table. And he engaged, as did Samson. In all Samson's messiness, God pushed him, he stirred him, and he also he was concerned about the people not crying out. He just wants us to engage. He wants us to move towards things, to take what we've got, to take the talent or take whatever we've got and say, I'm willing to do something. So anyway, that's the story, and it's where I'm landing right now. I would love to talk to you guys later about it, but I get excited about this. So when you study your Bible, look at what's stated, but also look at what's not stated, and it'll open up things in a really great way. Chris and Ann are going to share a few things here because I shared with them earlier about this. So anyway.
I think that even when you read Hebrews 13, it helped me because he said these guys God used to administer justice. I think he used Samson
That's good.
to administer his justice, right? With all of his weaknesses, he couldn't control his urges, his sexual urges. He struggled a lot. I can relate to him, this guy, a lot. But yet, even when you see him right before he dies, he's praying to God.
Right.
And he wants to do something for God. So even with all of, as you call, his mess, deep down in there, he wanted to do something for God. And I believe God answered that prayer. God honored that prayer, and he used them.
That's
So
great.
I think it's
Good point. Really. Any last thoughts?
I think I was even, I think I'm learning a little bit more about the judges in general and what a mess Israel was at the time, but how God always, he always has a plan for his people. He always, God's plan is the plan that will prevail, but we don't always know what it is or how's he going to accomplish that. And I like what you said about these guys were, at least they were going, they were in motion, they were, and even some of the other, judges that are listed, like Gideon, he had some good points and bad points, just like us, right? But he was doing something.
Right.
And I love that God can do something with the willingness to go, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, really cool.
Cool. Well, thanks, guys.